cooperation and investment. During his first term, the administration's approach aims to counter China's expanding influence in Africa by fostering partnership with African nations based on mutual economic interest. Additionally, Trump's policies reflected a broader nationalist agenda, among others. As a result, the African continent agenda, or the African agenda under Donald Trump, highlighted a more pragmatic, business-oriented stance. Now, the bone of contention is how the comeback of Trump will affect USA-Africa ties, and to a larger extent, how this will provide, or if this will provide a scope for Africa to redefine its own agenda along lines of politics, economy, foreign policy, among other key aspects. What edge for Africa in global politics, especially under the implications and for governance and development in Africa, and the role of the United States of America in defining Africa's stance, particularly under the new leadership of Trump that will kickstart officially on the 20th of January 2025. This is Global Insight. You're welcome. As events are unfolding and, of course, diplomacy taking another dimension, we continue to look at where Africa stands and to see if it is time for the continent to redefine its agenda, be it along political, economic, or social lines. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this edition of your discursive, informative program. It is Global Insight, brought to you by the Pan-African Television for You Media Africa. We want to look at Africa-US ties, and of course, looking at the comeback of Donald Trump, what age it presents for the African continent, and to answer practically if it's that time for Africa to take decisive moves as long as redefining its political agenda, its economic agenda, its even geopolitical agenda is concerned. And with a panel of esteemed guests, we are going to enter into the complexities or in-depth understanding of topic for this day, looking at the context of this topic, global politics, and if it is the right moment for the African continent to redefine its agenda, economic agenda, which will be, under the historic African continental free trade area that will match with the continent's agenda 2063. Welcome once more. Without much ado, we are going straight away to uncovering the panel this day, and let's make a first stop in Ghana to acknowledge the presence of Minister AMBE FOKWA, who is Director Association for Cultural Awareness, to also note that he's a journalist. Welcome to Global Insight this day, AMBE FOKWA.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation, Clarice.
And looking forward to having a constructive discussion with you and the other guests. To the United States of America, we acknowledge the presence of ultimately a journalist, historian, and IEC Lawyers Guild observer. Welcome this day, Mr. Mobley.
Thank you again, Clarice, for the invitation, and appreciate it. You have a wonderful panel here today, so I look forward to a really good discussion.
It's always a pleasure to have you join us to share insight on contemporary issues affecting not just the African continent, but the global world at large. And it gives us the scope for Africa through its stakeholders to define its positions. We stay in the United States of America with Professor David MONDA, international relations expert, public policy analyst. Welcome once more to the discursive show, Professor MONDA.
Thank you for having me.
And I will kick off with you. Let's understand the concept of our topic for this day, which dwells on global politics, and asking the question if it's the right time for the African continent to redefine its agenda at every level, actually linking it with the recent election results of the United States of America, and of course, looking at how this to a larger extent will affect the relationship between the United States of America and the African continent holistically.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a good time to redefine Africa's agenda. And I would premise that on three main pillars. Number one is the America First agenda. So African countries will need to readjust their foreign policy agendas and interests in light of that, because Trump is not an ideologue. He's more of a transactionalist and a neo-isolationist. So very much looking inward rather than outward. So Africa, number one, will really need to think about realigning, the continent's broad interests, in line with these new realities. I think the second element is in regard to AGOA and trade, and what was previously the Prosper Africa initiative under Donald Trump. I think he'll be looking to reboot that. A key element of the Prosper Africa initiative was two-way trade on bilateral levels. Sure. So the 54 countries will need to be thinking about broad areas of consensus that they have in terms of interacting with the US, because Trump, quite frankly, has had very little interest in Africa in his first term. I think that will continue in his second term. And I think Africa will need to really rethink, its trade policy towards the United States. I think, and then finally, the third premise I would highlight is redefining Africa's agenda away from Africa being a recipient to Africa being an active player. For too long, our continent's leaders have been reactive rather than proactive. They've been benign spectators rather than active participants. They tend to interact with the US in very asymmetrical terms, meaning the US is almost like a lord above, the subject continent. And I think that we really need to redefine that, where, we have a reboot in terms of this relationship, where African countries can come to the table as equal partners and actually negotiate on a win-win basis on terms that are mutually beneficial. So I think on those three broad areas, redefining the continent's interests in light of America First policy in terms of trade with AGOA and and Trump's policy in terms of neglecting the continent. Okay. But also rethinking how Africa engages with the US, whereby we're not always, coming to the US with begging bowls, coming to the US, from a position of subjects, but equal partners. And I think that will take some heavy lifting from the African Union, which unfortunately I don't think is happening at this point.
It's actually a subtle process, and eventually with the right mindset, like Kagame will always reiterate, I think gradually the continent will reach that milestone. And of course, a good premise will help to redirect the pattern for the African continent in the same perspective with you, Author Mobley, from the three key elements that Professor MONDA highlighted as the solid premise to see the need for Africa to redefine its agenda. What do you have to add to this? Should we limit just on this, or do you see other elements that need to occupy the premise for Africa's stance in the world of new realities as highlighted early on?
Well, I don't think we need to change our focus in Africa or even as African Americans, I think what we need to do is realize that Trump is a white supremacist. He represents a white supremacist mindset that is essentially going to reboot the colonial attitudes and atmospheres of the last 150 years or more. That's what they mean when they say make America great again. In order to make America great again, Africa needs to be subservient and with that begging bowl, as Dr. MONDA mentioned, we can't help but be in a disadvantaged position when white supremacists are so dominantly initiated and pronouncing their intentions. Trump has made his intentions very clear. He's referred to Africa as a group of S-hole nations. I won't use his pejorative, but I think that Trump has a definite, distinct white supremacist attitude. He is led and is starting to bring a cadre of well-known white supremacist elements into his administration, reintroducing those worst images and worst quantities of people into his administration that will carry out his policies against Black and brown people and people of Asian descent as they move forward. So I don't think that Africa needs to pay too much attention, any more attention than African Americans pay here in America. We certainly know that we have a very difficult 4 years ahead of us because of these attitudes and what is shaping up in terms of their policies and their approaches to dealing with us. Yeah. So we don't expect it to be any different for what they have in store for Africa. So I just say buckle up and hang on, and we need to definitely be vigilant and be a little bit more mindful of the need for our unity, our international unity, our African unity. Those things must gel because that is our only way to deal with white European dominance and supremacy and its intent.
Okay. And if actually you're saying that the new Trump administration will not bring something different, then the ball of contention goes back to the African stakeholders. And that is why I'm coming to you with this question. Mr. AMBE FOKWA, if we want to look at one of the first premises that Professor MONDA highlighted, that of America first, and we understand the concept of the bandwagon, and with the realities on the ground, how can African stakeholders cultivate the bandwagon, or maybe take the bandwagon theory into the concept of US first to Africa first, in line with defining new policies that suits the present contemporary society, where we see a lot of changes which have occurred along diplomatic lines, and you can name the rest.
Exactly, really, because as a progressive African, when Trump brings this policy of let's make America great, that's for Americans. The first question I like to ask my African American brothers as a global diasporan community is America your country? And when you start to build on that country, you start to approach this indigenous conflict that actually America is a former colony that was taken over from the original nations. We know so many of them, Cherokee, Chippewa, I mean, we could go on, but not digress. And when you look at that perspective and then turn to Africa and realize that also we too have a colonial conflict, it becomes now somehow contradictory for our African American brothers to feel that they should continue to position themselves in the U.S. with an intention even to contend the next 4 years. Here in Ghana, I know that President Nana in 2019 did actually initiate the Year of Africa Return, which was a collaboration which was inspired through interactions with people like Dr. Malena, and several others who laid the foundation for this concept of returning to Africa linked to the legacies and, I should say, philosophies, objectives of people like Marcus Garvey. Individuals like Kwame Nkrumah, who gave Ghana that priority with the whole Black Star symbolism at the Independence Day and the flag. The whole conception of let's make Africa great is not something new to us. We've been working on this since the 1960s, and I might go as far back as even saying 1441, when the first slaves were taken from Morocco and abducted.
Yeah.
So we need to look at our situation progressively in the light that if we're going to make Africa great, it first starts with an indigenous mentality of wanting to actually really get our boots on the ground in Africa as far as our African American brothers are concerned. Now, when I turn to the continent now, I look at my people, progressively knowing that these are pioneers had this intention. How far are we going now on the ground to create an enabling environment so that the intellectual capacity and the economic resource capacity that would come back from the diaspora would be able to form sustainable collaborations to challenge actually the conflicts that we are having here with neo-colonialism, imperialism, the fact that we have African leaders from Paul Biya to President Nana to even who, they all go into the office with very positive intentions, but when they meet up now, this neo-colonial construct, which has been in existence for thousands of years, we're not even talking hundreds of years, we could go back to Constantine with this idea of dominating the world and Roman imperialism. How do they overcome this now when they've been given a deficient economy, which is tapped now to the Western economies? When our citizenry, too, is very apathetic in voting and is easily dissuaded now behind Western media and its propaganda to not want to actually participate in the empowerment schemes that might be there. When we start to reason this out and see that actually from the grassroots to the presidencies and the civil society and in between, we all are supposed to actually be collaborating and doing what is necessary to prepare our continent to be great, then we start to come closer to real solutions. We have things like the BRICS initiative, which I'm going to lay out, that I think we should actually look at. Vladimir Putin was very, very clear in the last, I think was at the Russia summit, that they're trying to work on the idea of a new currency, the unit. Perhaps it wouldn't come so quickly, but the intention of the whole BRICS concept is that as opposed to using the dollar to always leverage our trade, to always have this concept that our currencies are so weak and they must be taxed to the dollar. You know, I'm just recently from Nigeria. I did a small transcontinental sojourn to try and understand why the African free continental trade is not being implemented. What are the immigration and type of protocols that we have to pass through when we move by land? And I realized that actually the dollar is trading in Nigeria at about 17 points. In Ghana, it's trading at 16 points to $1. Why is it that our currencies, and I want to speak specifically of our main English-speaking African countries, why do they tack the currency to the dollar? Is it because it's being printed by De La Rue in the UK? Or we can talk about the French countries. We all know their own conflict with having their currencies printed by the French, is it Banque de France? You see, we have to get out of these situations. And when we talk about BRICS now, BRICS comes with the logic that just like the Saudis decided earlier this year that they would no longer practice this petrodollar policy, which insisted on any country wanting to buy petrol, converting their currency into the dollar before now buying their crude oil. We're actually seeing that there is a logic to begin to trade in each other's currency starting to come into play under BRICS. And this already is something that it shows us that with Russia coming into play, and we know President Trump has a very, very cordial relationship with Vladimir Putin. I mean, 36 days ago, Vladimir Putin was on the air congratulating President Trump, even pointing out how he thought he was courageous in the way that after the attempted assassination on him, he stood up and kind of represented some defiance to whoever would challenge the fact that he has to come forward to do what he has to do. So I don't see Trump is even challenging BRICS with his relationship with Putin. It might work in our favor if we position ourselves.
Absolutely, and that is where we have the game. How do we position ourselves? And from the introductory statements that have been made so far pertaining our topic, Professor Monda, I come back to you now to ask this question, conversant with the new realities which you highlighted in your preamble. We want to understand what do you think are those areas where potential policy changes and even diplomatic strategies that the African continent, probably maybe under the African Union, could use to redefine Africa's standing at the international level in order to redefine a clear international agenda for the continent, particularly the economic agenda that will salvage the trajectory of growth and development for the continent.
So, Madam Chair, maybe I could just make a couple comments on what was previously said,
Absolutely.
Before I jump into your question. We have to play with the team we have, not the one we wish for. And the reality is, as much as Trump is a racist, a xenophobic, misogynist, he's the president of the United States. So I think it would be unrealistic for Africa to reject interacting with Donald Trump. Even if we wanted to, we can't, just because of the dominant position that the U.S. has, in the global economy. As much as we love Marcus Garvey, we love Sojourner Truth, we love the Pan-African spirit of the Manchester Conference and Jomo Kenyatta and Kwame Nkrumah, Marcus Garvey, Nnamdi Azikiwe, Bob Marley, Pan-Africanism will not feed us. Pan-African will not feed our continent. Pan-Africanism will not help reduce AIDS infections. Pan-Africanism will not raise the living standards of Africans. It's an ideology. And I'm not downplaying it, but I really think we need to rethink of how we can use these broad theories and ideas, to influence policy. And I don't really see us speaking specifically to that, and with specific regard to what you've mentioned in terms of clear, concrete terms, I think one of the big areas Africa can really re-engage with is renegotiating AGOA, which is up for renewal in 2025, on terms that are mutually beneficial to both Africa and the U.S. I think with Trump's America First policy, he will not only be looking to open the U.S. market duty-free to African imports, but he'll also be pressing Africa very strongly to open African markets to U.S. goods and services. And I'd like to highlight South Africa as one of the countries that might get pushed out of AGOA because the U.S. doesn't consider South Africa as a developing country. When we think of alternative forums for the African voice, again, these are practical steps to actually lift the living standards of Cameroonians, Kenyans, Nigerians, people on the ground. What will we do? I think in terms of multilateral frameworks, this is another very important area, the continent can leverage with the U.S. I think the Biden administration has talked about, supporting Africa's permanent seat, non-veto, but permanent seat on the Security Council. I think that's an agenda we should very aggressively push. But also for African nations to really leverage their numbers within the General Assembly of the United Nations Forum. Yeah. They have the voting power, they have the legitimacy, and they have the agency as global South countries to really affect policy. Another multilateral framework would be the G20, where Africa has actually, the AU has a seat. I think this is another forum we should really think about. I think, unfortunately, the climate change agenda will be thrown under the bus. The Nairobi Declaration which was, an African agenda, collective African agenda on climate change, on decarbonization, on moving away from the use of hydrocarbons and using Africa as a basis point for the green economy. I think Trump is very skeptical about climate change. He'll probably pull the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement immediately he takes office in January 2025, like he did in 2017.
Yeah.
But again, I cannot emphasize enough, as much as we love our Pan-Africanist views, our global consanguinity, our common sense of blackness and African identity, I think we really need to reshape those ideas into practical steps that actually help people on the ground. Yes, we're dealing with a xenophobic, racist, sexist leader, but it's the team you have to play with. You can't, decide what's in front of you. And, I think it will be very unhealthy for Africa to continue to play its cards the way it's been playing them in the past, because that has not helped. We've continually been marginalized and marginalized. And I think, lastly, I think one of the broad agenda areas I would think of, so that the 54 countries are not competing with each other to, talk to the United States or access the US or other major powers, be they the Russians or Chinese, is to then think about what are the common agendas we have for the continent around infant mortality, around more openness and fairness in terms of trade, right? Around the Yamoussoukro Accord, the Open Skies Accord. Africans are not flying to other African countries. We're not trading with each other. It's harder to fly from Nigeria to Guinea. You have to fly through France to get to Guinea. Or to come to Cameroon, you'd have to fly to Paris to come to Nairobi. So we're not really interacting with each other. And I don't think we've tapped into the African diaspora, say in Europe, our African diaspora in the United States, to really reimagine how we can use that black dollar and bring that black dollar into the continent. Africa doesn't need loans from Washington. We have enough resources on the continent to take care of ourselves. It's just the governance structures on the continent, Madam Chair, I think are one of the biggest problems on the continent. The fraud, the corruption, and the waste is mind-boggling. And it's a cycle that keeps getting perpetuated. When Western countries keep giving aid to African regimes, they know are misusing these funds. That keeps Africa continually, down.
Okay, of course, which is very imperative. And how can the ideology of a new Africa under the strong Pan-African vision be used to solve these internal problems that will provide the continent a larger scope at the international arena? Coming back to you to comment on the viewpoint of Professor MONDA, Mr. Otto Mobley, particularly, do you think the Pan-African vision of theory is not strong enough that can help Africa redefine its standing, especially in line with global politics and changing dynamics, and in so doing solving the internal problems which were just highlighted earlier on?
African unity is our only way out of what we face in Africa, what we face as Africans in the diaspora. We are homeless out here in the diaspora because we do not have a connection with a homeland that is free, a homeland that has any power to protect or engage or sustain us or even the people who are on the continent right now. And as Professor MONDA mentioned, we are a basket case of corruption and a really archaic situation on the ground. The way you solve that, the way you alleviate the problems that we face in Africa are to do the same things that great nations have done to grow and develop to the point that they are these superpowers, these highly sustainable nations that we are now on our knees begging to provide us loans, provide us aid, provide us with trade and those things that we think will allow us to sell at the marketplace of at least what they consider to be a equitable situation. Why are we conceding to America and Canada and Russia and China and India the power to tell Africa what will happen on the African continent, what they will accept from the African continent, who they will accept from the African continent, who they will respect as leaders and who they won't? It's an unsustainable position for us.
Yeah.
When we look at if I said, what were the five, give me, what are the largest powers in the world? If I ask you to name them, you would say China, you would say the US, you would say Canada, you would say India, you would say Russia. And then I would ask, what do they have in common? And you would look at the geography. It's all about geography. The geography says that the geography says that we are African continent, 54 micronations trying to get our voice heard over those other African nations competitively, as Dr. Munda just mentioned. So we can't continue in this vein and expect to get respect or to be able to negotiate. How can Togo negotiate with the United States? How can Kenya negotiate with the United States? How can Congo try and form some kind of government that can negotiate with China, or Sudan trying to negotiate, South Sudan or North Sudan trying to negotiate with Russia? It's a unsustainable, ridiculous position that we as Africans are apparently just comfortable with. So we have to break this mold. Again, those countries that I mentioned earlier that are the large countries, they did that because they had the sense and the temerity to consolidate their forces. They consolidated their people into China.
Okay.
It was Manchuria. It was all of the provinces that Japan and France had tried to colonize. China said, no, we are one nation. We are one entity. And they reconstructed and redefined who they were according to their own cultural principles and background.
Absolutely.
Russia, India have done essentially the same thing. We can criticize, the United States for its colonial efforts to take over indigenous populations in the U.S. and Canada as well, but they consolidated into huge land masses and created very powerful countries based on their geopolitical access to their own resources that are in those countries.
Okay.
Africa, on the other hand, is fractionalized, and we have to get beyond this balkanization and fractionalization of Africa before we can negotiate with anybody. How are you trying to negotiate with Europe and you have no sense of unity in your own country? Kwame Nkrumah said it way back in 1958 at the Casablanca conference. We need to unite, and until Africa unites, Africa is going to continue to be the victims of those countries who are united and who have the power to play like Africa is subject to them.
Okay.
I mean, it's ridiculous.
And Of course, and even the element of that unity actually lies on how we can solidify or solve the internal problems. We are going to continue with you, AMBE, in line with trade, since you already highlighted the dollar, and we know that Trump during his campaign speech actually said that a war on war on dollar, maybe any attempt to shift the dollar from its position will lead to some sort of war. Now let's look at the implications that the Trump's maybe protectionist trade policies can have on the African economy, and its ability to engage in is there an ability to turn some of these negative consequences into the positive, positive like opportunities to be able to benefit the two countries in terms of trade, since we noticed that during the first term Trump actually prioritized trade to aid when it comes to African countries?
I'd like to ask a hypothetical question to our first panelist, Mr. Arthur. If we are really serious about indigenous development, I never said Pan-Africanism. I think I talk more in terms of African consciousness. I myself, I have my pushbacks against Pan-Africanists because they themselves, like Mr. Arthur, they define their rhetoric with an academic stance without necessarily really looking at a lot of realities on the ground, and then wind up contradicting themselves, because he speaks a lot about Africa basically picking itself up by its bootstraps, but then he labels Trump a racist, which I've not been able to confirm. I know Trump has very close relationships in the past with people like Mike Tyson, was interviewed by Oprah Winfrey. Even the P. Diddy and Scandal is a very close collaborator, but beyond him, since people will select that as an individual with a controversial background, there's so many others we could name. So many other African Americans did actually vote for Trump. So it's strange when someone calls Trump a racist. I think Trump maybe has a racist support base, like our brother actually, not Mr. Arthur, actually it was Professor MONDA who came up with that academic stance. Yes, pardon me for that mistake. Actually, Mr. Arthur actually has highlighted this fact that in this whole scheme, we do have to come back to working together. And it's strange if Professor MONDA, taking the academic stance against Pan-Africanism, therefore classifies President Trump as a racist, but then still says these are the team members we have to go to work with. So what he's saying is that we who want to be liberated, who want to create sustainable development and be independent, have to beg a racist to do it. So my question really, AGOA, what is AGOA really giving us that African states could not give themselves? We all know that these loans that we take from these Western nations, actually, they're our money coming back to us. If I tell you about Kaiser Aluminum and their control of the Volta Dam here in Ghana, which Kwame Nkrumah actually took a loan from the United States to establish, but indirectly is the very reason he was ousted from power, with the fear that he would privatize it to actually give the electrical consumption that would be needed to his country in the west of Africa, the sustainable electrical infrastructure that it needed. Then how do we keep looping ourselves inside this belief that we're giving them money by automatically having trade deals and exploitative contracts, some of them 200, 300 years old, even with countries like France and Britain? How do we keep putting ourselves in this mentality that we're going to work with these racists to get ourselves out of a situation that they actually created and benefit from, and they are actually able to give us loans through resources that they extract from us, and then, basically turn it into their economy, transform it to manufactured goods, sell it, raise up their GDP, and then give us back a little bit because one president wants to take a small $60 million, $100 billion, these small loans that they get, which they know are going to be misappropriated, which they know if these leaders actually did try to fully set up the infrastructure that was needed, they might oust them. I mean, we're talking about America. This country is willing to oust the president of Guatemala just to keep banana contracts moving for their multi-corporations.
Okay.
This whole racist ideology is ingrained in their entire corporate mentality. That's what colonialism was. Go to these people you believe are inferior, give them a mentality of inferiority, and install aristocratic puppets that can therefore leverage the resources to them, and then keep them turning around in a circle with the belief that they're developing, that, you know, a lot of intellectuals will come there, be educated, and then be trained to think that they have a solution. But the solution they bring only sustains that globalization logic of a top to bottom system, and the Africans over there, oh, they just haven't got it right. They just haven't got it right.
Yeah.
I think Captain Ibrahim Traoré at one point realized this and decided to get this right. We're going to have to do what is really necessary. Like I think Mr. Arthur was trying to point out, that we should look at some of these things that have been done by these great nations to truly become great. And if you have to go like Niger and you realize that Mohamed Bazoum is selling your uranium at 80 cents on the dollar, but instead the actual international price for uranium is being sold at about $200 per kilogram, then they had to take him out of office and kind of classify him as a domestic threat to the state, which is what he would be tried as, from what individuals have told me, so that they can therefore begin to leverage the resources in their country, in union now, because yes, we're gradually, I'm glad you said it, Clarice, a process. So if you have in the Sahel region, Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, gradually making a block, and this ideology is being represented. Captain Traoré took over about 3 gold mines in Burkina Faso, which the French had defaulted on contracts for, but some corruption was keeping them in play. I think gradually we are taking the bootstraps mentality of creating that enabling environment. It's just that if we have individuals amongst us who still think that we have to do this with some type of influence from the West, dealing with people who they claim that they acknowledge truly do not like us, then it's going to be more complicated. We need to acknowledge that in this world, globalized world as they call it, you have to leverage. No country is an island. If Captain Traoré now has to leverage with Russia to get a militaristic stance so that he won't have this pushback from America. If Mali's able, or is it Niger's able to push out Africa command bases from their continent, and Trump is someone who comes now with the mentality that I'm not interested in going into Africa in this dimension of making America great and having a more of a, I don't want to say isolationist approach, but more looking at what America needs to do for itself. Then let us also adopt that mentality.
Madam Chair, are you going to allow us to respond?
I'll come back to you.
Excuse me, please. Excuse me, please.
Please just run up, please.
Yes, because if we're not going to avoid the contradiction of assuming that we'll work with racists to liberate ourselves, then I think that, I mean, we're never going to get through. We're never going to get through. The problem's not even Africa, it's more of our academics.
Okay, and of course, how can we use, bring in more patterns? You wanted to comment on that, Professor MONDA?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I think Mr. NKANWI misunderstood what I said. You know, I made the analogy, you have to work with the team you have, not the team you wish for. So that's not meaning that we're begging a racist to help us, but I'm saying you're admitting the reality of what the world is, of the world you have, not the one you wish for. Yeah. So, of course, we have a racist in the White House. And if Mr. NKANWI believes that Trump is not a racist, well, I invite you to find the numerous evidence of his history of racism, right, with the Central Park 5 and all the way till 2024 and counting. Think of how he dealt with Kamala Harris. So, I mean, that's a conversation for another day. But I think it's really important, again, to take an academic perspective, because academics have value. We also have value. We don't have a monopoly, but we have value. Practitioners have value. Sure. So I think seeing the world from different bases, the academic base, I think is extremely important. I think the practitioner base is extremely important. The lived experience base is also extremely important. So, of course, I'm very excited to take an academic base. And I take an academic base, Madam Clarice, to understand the international structure. I'm not just talking about an ideal of what I wish for. I'm dealing with what is Right now, the dollar is the reserve currency for international trade. That's a situation we've had since 1945, when we had the Washington Consensus, this agreement between the World Bank, the IMF, and the US Treasury. The US established an order that we have to play in. This is our pitch. We can't play outside the pitch. This is a pitch that has been established by the US and its European allies. We have to play within that. This is my point. And we have to deal with characters, in the case of Donald Trump, that you might not always be amiable to because of their racist views and ideology. So I am dealing with a context that we have now, not one I wish for. I'm not emphasizing Pan-African ideals as much as I respect them and I love them. I'm trying to put food on the Cameroonian mom's table. I'm trying to put food on the African people's table. I'm trying to think of how do we deal with structures that exist now within the Washington Consensus, within trade regimes and structures that are there now to help our people. We can talk about Marcus Garvey and talk about, Africanness as much as we want, but we have to deal with the reality we have today. I'd also like to say, just in conclusion, also that, as we have this conversation, we talked previously about BRICS, right? And I like the idea of de-dollarization, of getting an alternative currency to the US dollar. But Madam Chair, you know, the Chinese are not willing to have their yuan as a reserve currency. They're not willing to revalue their yuan because that's going to raise the value of their Chinese currency, and that will affect their exports. Sure. Plus, they don't have the military to support, the yuan as a global currency, the way the US backs the dollar. Plus, the other element of the dollar is it's been a reserve currency for so long, there's normative elements related to it. But by that, I mean, countries have for years just been comfortable with the dollar as a reserve currency. There's no other global currency that comes anywhere close. But I think lastly, I must also add, we also need to be very careful with these African militaristic regimes that have come up in the Sahel. Number one, that have overturned democratic governance of, in a lot of cases, democratically elected regimes. Use military might to repress their people. So we cannot celebrate that. Secondly, when they kick out the French, they kick out the Americans, who do they bring in? They bring in another oppressor, the Russians. The Russians are not selling them weapons because they love to liberate and help Africans. The Russians are looking after their own interests. So I really also, on that element with the Sahelian crisis, with Niger, with Chad, with Guinea, with Burkina Faso, we need to be careful about celebrating military regimes that are undemocratic, that are repressive, and that replace one colonial power with another in the name of freedom. I think we're really perpetuating a very horrible cycle. We know the effects of military regimes in Ghana. The coup d'etats Ghana had on and on and on in the 70s and 80s. That really pushed the country back. Think of Nigeria, coup d'etat after coup d'etat after coup d'etat. It did not help. So I think we really need to be careful not to romanticize what's going on in the French Sahel, because I think those countries are actually in for a much tougher experience in the days coming forward.
And of course, it still brings us to the question, what age for the African continent? And of course, what is the pattern or the line or the approach that stakeholders are taking to ensure that Africa redefines its agenda in face with the realities of global politics? And this brings us to the question of, democracy, sovereignty, and how, new governance structures can be set in place or patterns to suit the changing times in order to give Africa that added each that maybe may answer the preoccupations of Professor MONDA on the effect of the drastic changes which are occurring, particularly in the Sahel region. Mr. Mobley.
Yes, thank you again, Clarice. And just let me clear a call here real quick. And okay, I was able to clear a call that was coming in. Okay. I'm having to work on my phone this morning. Pan-Africanism and in any form is still a great solution for what plagues Africa right now. The solutions to Africa's problems are just below the surface, but are always very close to the hearts and minds of all people who are in Africa. We know from experience going back to '61, then later in the late '70s and early '80s with the Southern African rebellions and then their elimination of apartheid from the continent. That was all done by military means. It was done by progressive thinking Africans who liberated Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Angola, Guinea-Bissau, but also South Africa in the process. Those looked to be at the time an alliance, at least coming together for Southern Africa, where they could consolidate resources. They had begun to talk about things as a patriotic front so that they could work together and create those kinds of synergies that we see in the Sahel now. I would not dismiss what is going on in the Sahel when you overthrow and get rid of a really dictatorship masquerading as a democracy. You are doing your people a favor. And as Brother AMBE mentioned about what Bazoum was doing, for example, there in Guinea, to convert that to Niger, to what is occurring there now is an improvement. We have to move forward. We have to keep moving forward to reshape. But the problem again is that we've got 54 African states, and you've got to do this in each one of these small places. So if there is a regional alliance that comes out of what is going on in Senegal and Burkina Faso and Mali and Niger and Guinea and Chad, even, that Sahel combine will be the emphasis and the beginning of what needs to be done over the rest of the African continent. We have to consolidate our resources, our borders, our people to get to the place where we also represent 1.5, 1.7 billion people, as China does, as India does, and then can take that to the world stage, can take that to the UN and say, we are these people, we are African people, and this is what we want. We want a permanent seat on any kind of council, Security Council, and it needs to be one that has veto power. We can't keep accepting substandard treatment from the rest of the world when we are the world's resource bank. That's why they want to keep Africa fractionalized. That's why they want to keep African countries minimalized in these 54 individual little puzzle pieces. And if we can't see and understand that, then we are doomed to list into the future for another 100 years under the same circumstances that we're in now, because we don't have the power as a Nigeria or as an Algeria or a Morocco to negotiate with Europe or the United States or China or Russia from that standpoint. We're always going to be hat in hand, and we have to understand that we have the power among ourselves. We need one continent, we need one currency, we need one military, and then we can negotiate with the rest of the world. And until we realize that or get to as close a configuration to what I've just mentioned as possible, we are going to be disrespected. Nobody cares that you're in Cameroon. Nobody cares about Burkina Faso by itself. You're no bigger than a state in America.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And I think it's going to be a sort of process like we underlined earlier on. Now, there is this school of thought that has been shared by Professor MONDA. And when you look at events happening across the continent, you see that there are actually drastic moves that are being taken. Now, in the line of international relations, there is need to redefine policies and see how you can engage with all the partners that will benefit your own agenda. And this brings us to this problematic AMBE, to see how, conversant with the changes we have highlighted, the Western hegemony, which Professor MONDA says this is the reality today. So now, with this new impetus or new realities of sovereignty and other aspects already coming into play, how can we navigate the existing, system to, review things that will benefit the continent more, rather than waiting for a more drastic new machinery or pattern that will take maybe some years before we get to the materialization of the ideologies that we are actually advocating for at this particular moment?
Well, Corliss, I'm going to be very honest. We are the boots on the ground. We are here. So when we want to look at the concept of academic theory being read in a university that is across the Atlantic, it really does not take into cognizance the reality that at the grassroots level, our African population has not received truly the education to realize the depth of what we call African geopolitics in relation to solving this situation. That is really the biggest thing. And we have to acknowledge that to first really solve this on the ground, it's not necessarily just classrooms that need to prioritize giving education. So when I say education, I'm not talking about only the primary school and the secondary school, high school, or the lyceum or at universities. No, just the way social media too promotes communication and information. Just the way that we could say even from our religious institutions, the way that they conscientize the human mind. How far are they bringing our people into this realization of self-identity? And if it's not being worked on, then we have to realize that that is where we also need to start to move in this direction of a process. Because if you cultivate the minds now, of course, knowing that maybe in 20, 25 years, with the concrete strategy, with the evolution that is in play, because really, we have to take note of facts like before even a lot of African countries or developing countries or even first world countries like Russia could adjust their foreign policy. Looking again at this idea of BRICS, everyone was actually waiting to see who was going to win the 2024 U.S. presidential election, going back to, of course, Trump being the central focus of our discussion and how African countries are supposed to be trying now to align their own internal and foreign policies towards their own development. Now that we know Trump is actually in the chair, and I want to bring back this idea of BRICS and him giving a position that he's going to maybe try to defend the petrodollar. You have to realize that this is exactly why BRICS now comes to being very important on this role and evolution of letting our people become enlightened to be aware of the value of BRICS, to the point that eventually we have countries spreading this boots from the ground mentality, not saying that all countries must go militaristic, but they must accept that we have to solve our problems. Like Brother Malcolm said it, using any means necessary, but in the context of us looking at the realistic geopolitics, of course, I really like how Mr. Arthur said it. One individual African country can't run up against the beast. No, it can't. So we have to allow this time to evolve, let our people come into realization. If BRICS could truly materialize, like I'm sure President Putin would like President Xi Jinping would like, though Trump would not like it, the racist. That is not our problem, which is why we should not be prioritizing going to beg the racist. We should look now to doing business leverages with countries which actually have demonstrated that they don't have this same racist foreign policy. In the BRICS ideology, you see South Africa being represented, to the fact that if we could get this idea of a common currency outside of the dollar, or the logic of trading in each other's currency outside of the dollar, we move away from the fact that the US dollar in 1972, if I'm not